African Americans have been playing baseball for as long as white people have been playing baseball. As the sport began to take hold in popularity post-Civil War, Black people were there always. There were organized Black teams, and they barnstormed. They played against other Black teams. They played against white teams.
There were Blacks who did play with whites on teams. The team was majority white. It may have one or two Black players on it. And that seemed to be something that was more acceptable to the white paying public if they only had one or two Black players, as opposed to a team that might have majority Black players and one or two white players.
But as we move forward through history, we see that segregation starts to tighten its hold.
Hi, I'm Chuck Braverman. This is another episode of Westdoc Online. I want to remind you we're brought to you in part by Real Screen Summit, which is coming up in January in New Orleans. It's for the nonfiction world, reality, documentaries. It's a place you ought to be if you're in that world. Take a look at Real Screen at the bottom of our westdoconline.com front page. There's an icon, and click on it to take you right to the information. We have a great episode today with a fabulous, experienced filmmaker named Sam Pollard, who's just finished a feature documentary called The League. Let's say hi to Sam. Hi, how are you, Sam?
I'm good, Chuck. How are you today?
I'm great, thanks. In our little pre-conversation, we established you're in Lower Manhattan.
Yes, I am. 26 Broadway.
26th and Broadway.
No, 26.
26 Broadway. I love New York. It's my second city. And a lot of people think I'm from New York. I'm not sure if I'll take that as a compliment, but I'm not. But my father, just as a side note to baseball, grew up across the street, literally, from Ebbets Field.
Oh, okay.
So I was born Dodger fan, there was just like you said, your father, I think, was a St. Louis fan. My dad, grew up and went to Ebbets Field all the time. So, and I went back and visited his home, and of course Ebbets Field is long gone, but I could see how close it was. I mean, it was literally a baseball throw away from where he lived. So
right, that's nice.
I grew up watching the Dodgers. You made this fabulous film called The League. Do you want to give us the short version of what the film is about for people that may not have a clue?
The film looks at the evolution of the Negro Leagues from 1920, when it was founded by Rube Foster in Kansas City, Missouri, with other Negro League owners. And it looks at the evolution of the league from the 20s and the 30s. The heyday was, one of the other heydays was in the 30s in Pittsburgh with the Homestead Grays and the Pittsburgh Crawfords. They had people like Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige and Cool Papa Bell. And then we see the evolution of the league into the 40s with the Kansas City Monarchs, the Newark Eagles. And then after Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball in 1947, the league basically in the 50s was dying out. So by 1960, Negro Leagues no longer existed. But it was a really good run for the Negro Leagues and many great ball players besides Gibson, Max Manning, Monty Irving, Larry Doby, Don Newcomb, Roy Campanella. All of those players became Major League players. But they all came out of the Negro Leagues.
So the Negro Leagues died basically because of the integration in the American League. And one of the, I thought I knew a little bit about history. And one of the most startling facts that comes out right away in your documentary is the fact that African American baseball players and white players played together all the time in the 19th century. And so what happened that changed all that, do you think? So that it was totally segregated from what, roughly 1900 to 1947? Yeah.
Well, what happened was a gentleman named Cap Anson, who's in the Hall of Fame. when he was playing in the major leagues in the early 20th century, one day he decided he did not want to play with any other Negro League players who were on the team or any other team. So that led to a ban of African American players from Negro League from major league teams. Because the thing to remember is that a lot of us thought, as a young man, I thought Jackie Robinson was the first African American to integrate major leagues, but it really was a gentleman named Moses Fleetwood Walker back in the 1880s. So when Cap Anson basically set that rule that he didn't want to play with Negro players, other team owners, white team owners, had the same attitude. So that led to a ban of Negroes from Major League Baseball, and led to people like Rube Foster and other black owners creating Negro League teams, like the Chicago Elite Giants, the Homestead Grays, the New York Black Giants. Other teams got created in the 1920s when the Negro National League was created by Rube Foster in Kansas City.
And looking at your film, I don't know. I mean, it's funny. How do I say this in the right way? It looked wonderful. The Negro Leagues, as it were, and it looked like everybody came dressed to the nines, and everybody was having a great time, and baseball for them at the time was great. I'm not saying that the segregation was a good idea. I'm just saying that it was working in the 20s and 30s.
Well, the thing to remember, Chuck, is that, here we are living in the Jim Crow era. Black people are sequestered in their own communities, but they had to survive. They had to have a life. So they had, stores, they had churches, they had recreational places to go to. They had, clothing stores to buy clothes. They had to have forms of entertainment. One form of entertainment was Negro League baseball. So they were able to go see baseball games. And back then, and it wasn't, black people like to dress up. They like to dress up. I mean, in reality, a lot of people, white and black, like to dress up back then. Everybody wore suits and ties and hats, so it was a stylish thing, I mean, the clothing style of America has changed tremendously, but back in the 20s and 30s, it was normal to see people wearing suits every day. On Sunday or after going to a ball game, you wear a suit, you wear a jacket, you wear a tie. So it was a part of this, they were struggling with segregation and Jim Crow, but they also said, well, let's have a life, and let's have our own self-sufficient life. And that's what black people did. They had no choice.
Let's take a look at the trailer for the league.
Negro Leagues baseball was so popular that black churches would move their service time up an hour so fans could go to the game. If you know anything about the black church, you don't mess with service time.
There were African-American professional ball players in the 19th century.
But segregation starts to tighten its hold.
Well, what do you do?
We can do this on our own.
A few entrepreneurs see that a black club can be a successful business.
Rube Foster.
Light years ahead of his time.
Effa Manley.
The first lady of black baseball.
Negro Leagues players made the game more up-tempo, bunt and run.
Base stealing. These incredibly acrobatic catches.
The major leaguers would say that the Negro Leagues didn't play the game the right way. Really, that was saying they didn't play the game the white way. Wherever you had successful black baseball, you typically had thriving black economies.
You have vendors and you have advertising. People were making money from it.
But integration was going to kill their businesses.
It was good morally, but that progress came at a cost.
White fans saw a kind of baseball they had never seen before.
The great ball players of the leagues.
Jackie Robinson.
Buck Leonard.
Satchel Paige.
Willie Mays.
Cool Papa Bell. Oscar Charleston.
Joshua Gibson.
Would transform the game.
They are a part of a movement. Before we coined the term civil rights movement.
Man, they didn't care about making no history. They just wanted to play ball. But the pride, the passion, the courage in the face of adversity, that's the real story.
Doing a little research about you beforehand, I went to IMDb Pro. You have one of the longest lists of films that I've seen in a while. It just goes on and on and on, and it's a very, very impressive. Not the least of which, of course, is the fact that you have edited 4 or 5 films for Spike Lee, which is pretty impressive. But I'm curious as to how you got started. What's your background, and how did you get into the film business?
Well, Chuck, it was over 50 years ago. As a young 22-year-old man, I was going to Baruch College in New York City with the goal to become a businessman and wear 3-piece suits and drive a fancy car. And in my junior year at Baruch College, I was very despondent with the classes I was taking. And one day I went to see my college counselor. I said I was looking for an after-school internship. And she asked me, she said, well, what are your interests, Sam? And I said 2 things, Chuck. I said I love reading books, Faulkner, Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Wright, Hemingway, and I loved old Hollywood movies. I had grown up on watching Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas and Robert Mitchum and Ava Gardner and Susan Hayward and Lana Turner. I loved all these Hollywood movies from MGM and Warner Brothers and Universal Pictures. So she told me about a workshop that had been started by the public television station in New York, WNET, in 1968 after Dr. King's assassination, to get more Black people and Latino people in the film business, behind the scenes, learning how to direct, learning how to edit, learning how to shoot. And I got into this workshop, which is a 1-year program, and they taught us how all the basic rudiments of how to make films, shooting 16 millimeter. And at the end of that 1-year program, I got hired as an apprentice editor on a low-budget film titled Ganja and Hess, directed by an actor, writer, producer, director named Bill Gunn. And the editor on that feature film was a dramatic film named Victor Konevsky. Took me under his wing, and I became his apprentice and his assistant and then his associate editor, and that was the start of this long journey.
That's a great story. I mean, the one thing that surprised me, just as there was the Negro League of Baseball, there was the Negro equivalent of the film world, in the Black, I guess probably more urban areas. There was a distribution of low-budget independent films that were happening. Were you a fan of those also?
I knew a little bit about the films of Oscar Micheaux and Spencer Williams, but I didn't really see them that much until later in my career. But I was aware of those filmmakers. I was aware of, Paul Robeson primarily, doing Body and Soul, doing The Emperor Jones.
He was an exception because he was such a superstar.
He was a big star, so I was very aware of him. And then, like a lot of us, I was a big fan of Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte.
And I noticed in the notes that you are a teacher, or you were or are still a teacher at NYU.
I was a professor of undergraduate film and television at New York University for 27 years. I retired last year, 2000.
What year? When did you start?
I started teaching at NYU in 1994.
So my son went to Tisch. My son Alex went to Tisch, and when David Irving was there at the time, I guess, right?
He's still there. David Irving's still
there. Is he?
There.
I haven't. Yeah. I should give him a call, look him up. I knew David long before he was a teacher at Tisch.
Right. And he was in film school.
That's right. I noticed also in the credits that you have Amir Questlove Thompson as one of your producers, and we did an episode on Summer of Soul with him back in January of 2022, before, I think it was before the nomination or before he was even on the short list. And so how does it work? And there's a list of 5 or 6 or whatever number of producers. How did that work on this film?
Well, Questlove had heard about the project when we pitched it. I was pitching the project along with one of the other producers, Byron Motley, and Quest had heard about the project through Radical Media, and he decided he wanted to get involved as an executive producer. He had heard about the Negro Leagues as a young man through his family, and he wanted to get involved. So he came on board. And you know, sometimes when you're making these documentaries, you need someone who has usually a big name, and Quest's name helped in raising the funds. And then he was involved in looking at cuts and giving us feedback. You know, like a lot of producers, he wasn't on location, but he did look at the cuts, gave us feedback, gave us notes, and he was very helpful in some areas.
And so you mentioned the magic word, so to speak, and raising funds. What was the process of raising funds? And can I ask, where did you get the funds? And can you give me a ballpark?
The process, Chuck, was long and arduous. It took about 10 years.
Wow.
It took about 10 years. I was approached by Byron Motley, whose dad, Bob Motley, had been a former Negro League umpire in the late 40s and the 50s. They had written a book together about his father's adventures growing up and being an umpire in the Negro Leagues. And then they came to me, reached out to me, and asked me if I was interested in directing the documentary. And I was, because I grew up being a big baseball fan. And we went out, we beat the bushes looking for money. And finally, when we got Radical Media involved with Questlove as an executive producer, we went to Magnolia and another company called 2929 and a third company called Play Action that was founded by Jeffrey Lurie. And those 3 companies put together the money to help us make the film. And we really got rolling about 3 years ago in terms of pre-production, bringing on an archival producer, bringing on a story producer. And then we shot it over about a year and a half ago. And
I noticed that from just looking at the trailer that Magnolia is distributing, I guess, the film theatrically.
It starts today.
And so today, as we record this, is July 7th. Well,
right.
Congratulations. Are you going after this, running somewhere to the theater to see the film and be there?
I've seen it on the big screen 3 times already. So there's a screening tonight in Brooklyn, so I'll go to that one.
That's great.
Right.
And is there a streamer or a network or anybody attached?
It'll start streaming, I think, July 14th on Amazon and Hulu and Apple. So all of those streaming services you can.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. That's great. So everybody can see, because sometimes we find a great film and it's running in a theater for a week, and only in LA and New York and maybe Chicago, and everybody else is looking. And by the time I do this, I usually take a few days before I put it on the air, and then they can't see it sometimes.
I know, but this Magnolia's been doing a great job. They've been doing a fantastic job publicizing the film.
What was the editorial process in terms of, how did you attack this?
Well, usually when you're dealing with a film, a documentary editorially, you try to frame it in terms of the chronology. And sometimes you make some adjustments in the chronology as you're trying to give it some dynamism and some pacing. And I would say to you, the first couple of versions of the film was much slower, wasn't as fast paced. We hadn't had the music in yet. We didn't have the animation or the recreations in yet. So it was the first couple of iterations were just interviews and archival. And then we felt we needed to amp up the energy, amp up the excitement, the cinema of it. So then we decided we were going to go down to Rickwood Stadium in Birmingham, Alabama, where the Birmingham Black Barons used to play. We found some African-American college students who played baseball. We put them in some of those old uniforms like the Kansas City Monarchs and some other teams and put them out on the field. And we recreated some different plays they would go through as Negro League players. And then we decided, when we got back to editing room and cut in those recreations, that there were some stories that we weren't going to be able to tell with recreations. We decided to use animation. So we found this couple of animation people who we thought could capture the quality and the flavor of that period of the 1920s and the 1930s specifically.
Were you finding talent that you used in the film from kids who had been your students at NYU to some extent?
Not in this particular shoot. I've used NYU students in other shoots, but not this one. The talent we used is basically baseball talent, and we needed some good baseball players, so we found those in Birmingham. But the behind the scenes, this production, I didn't use, well, that's not true. I take it back. I did use a couple of production assistants who were former NYU students. I did.
That's when I'm teaching at Cal State Northridge in the film department, and you know, there's always one or two kids that are just outstanding, you know, and you can have a whole class of terrific kids, but you know that kid in the back row, you know, is way ahead of the class, and there's always somebody. What are you working on next?
October 6th, I have another film that's going to premiere on the PBS series American Masters about the drummer, composer, activist Max Roach, who performed with Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Clifford Brown, Abbey Lincoln, Sonny Rollins. It's a film that I've been working on for many, many years. I knew Max personally, so it's a film that's very close to my heart. And then later in the fall, I finished an HBO documentary co-directed with a gentleman named Lou Smith about a book written by the New York Times op-ed columnist Charles Blow called The Devil You Know, about the idea of African Americans moving back south to gain more economic and political power. So those two films will be coming out in the fall.
Is that happening now?
That's happening more and more. There's been a definite remigration to the South from the North by African Americans. I'm the perfect example. Last year, I moved from New York City to Baltimore, Maryland.
Because?
Well, economically, it was just more efficient. It's expensive to live in New York.
I don't really think of Baltimore as the South, but I guess that whole Washington, D.C. area
it is the South. When you think about it, it's the South. It's not the deep South, but it's the South.
Right. Well, there's a film right there for sure, which you're making. So that's pretty fascinating.
Always trying to make new films, Chuck.
And so the American Masters, I noticed one of your credits was about Sammy Davis Jr. Was that American Masters?
That was American Masters.
And was that with Michael Cantor as executive, or was that someone
Michael Cantor, yes.
What is the process for filmmakers that want to do a film for American Masters these days?
It's either two ways. Either you bring an idea to American Masters and then you got to figure out how to raise the funds, or American Masters brings an idea to you and they've raised the funds. And that was the case with Sammy Davis Jr. Michael had raised the funds. They were looking for a director. I had known Michael for quite a while, and he brought me on board.
You know, the other thing that's sort of startling in the film, although it wasn't news to me, but it's still kind of shocking about the African American soldiers coming back from World War II, having, you know, risked their lives and served honorably in the service, and yet, you know, weren't welcomed back into society as they should have been. And the fact that, I don't know, Jackie Robinson sort of broke that barrier and opened the door again, so to speak, was brought out in your film. And the other fact that you haven't discussed, which I thought was really interesting, was that the Negro Leagues played a different kind of baseball, which, you know, was more exciting and more running and stealing bases, supposedly.
Well, if you go back, Chuck, and you watch some of those clips of even Jackie Robinson on the Brooklyn Dodgers, you can see the energy, the sassiness he had on the field. You know, the way he would sort of get off the first base, taunt the pitcher before he would steal second or steal third. I mean, that was a different kind of style, and that style, as you know and I know, became a part of Major League Baseball. When you think of people like Murray Wills, you think of people like, Lou Brock, you think of people like, all these Willie Mays, all these players who brought a lot of flair to the game.
Well, I want to thank you so much. I think your film is great. I strongly advise anybody who's interested in documentary filmmaking, baseball, history, anything in the above, or even if you're not interested in any of those, I think you'll have a great time seeing this film.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Enjoy your day.
Thanks, Sam, for being a guest.
My pleasure.